All right, welcome everybody. So some discussion to begin with on the land acknowledgement statement. I want to acknowledge it's there, and we can determine later on if it's most appropriate to read these every time, but we want to acknowledge the land acknowledgement statement itself. But I'm not going to read it just this moment. The first thing on our agenda, other than call to order, is to discuss the possibility of a data analyst FTE. This idea comes out of a need that has been sort of apparent in our criminal justice system for the last few years as we've tried to tackle and or grasp the concepts associated with criminal justice system information. And so the discussion here today is to find out if A, this is something that you are all in agreement that is an appropriate ask or something to go after, and B, what would that look like? And then C, what other things must we consider if we were talking about this kind of a concept? So let me cast a fairly large net to talk about this idea. So as we've been going through the criminal justice system information over the last, like I said, 3 years or so, as the index committee came on board, it came fairly obvious pretty quickly that we are doing something in our community that really should be a model for other agencies and other criminal justice systems. And the work we're doing here isn't really duplicated anywhere else. But the things that are not unique to us is that we have a lot of siloed information. We've got a lot of departments and agencies and essentially receptacles for information that do not share information with one another. And so over the course of time, it's difficult to track what information is accessible, how that information can be used to influence decision making and policy making, and how those decision points direct the impacts essentially of the criminal justice system and the components over the years. And so the idea that I've been sort of asking for or kicking around for the last few months and years is that we need really three things in order to make what we're currently using more functional. We need some way to gather information, a receptacle, a physical, a bucket, a bin, a server, if you will, that we can use to gather information. We need some software, some interface that we can use that we can pull information from information sources throughout the criminal justice system. And then we need somebody with keen eyes and the ability to understand what data has been collected, and that person would then review information and make available reports, specific information as requested or needed to guide a discussion for, again, if we do this, if we twist this knob, if we pull this lever in the overall criminal justice system, what impact does it have downstream, upstream? And so it helps to have a better picture of what's going on in the criminal justice system if we have somebody with information that you can gather and pull and be ready at your fingertips. That's been kind of my bent and sort of the drum I've been banging on for a long time. That being said, the question that I have for the group is, are those suppositions that I've come up with before valid? If they are, I would like to have a discussion about what does that look like for us. I have ideas in my head. I don't want to poison the well, so to speak, by saying what I think would be important for me, but I would like to hear from the group if anybody either agrees, disagrees, and has anything to bring to the table on this. So I will entertain comments and questions, and I will bring it all back together once we're through the discussion points. Anybody have anything to say? Stephen?
Hi, Caleb. I appreciate being invited to this meeting and thanks for having me. I'm not sure I retained all three of the pieces of the system you outlined, but I definitely think a data analyst that can oversee some of this. I think it needs a human set of eyes and skills. B, I think an overarching platform that somehow is the repository for various current silos of information is a critical piece. It's the third one I can't remember, but at least those two I certainly think you're on target proposing.
That's fair. So the three pieces are people, infrastructure, and software. So there's three components. And Barry?
Yeah, Caleb, I'm totally in agreement with your proposal, and I would be excited to get it funded as well. So count me in. I think you're really, we've had this discussion a few times, you and I, and I'm really glad we're moving this forward. So thank you.
Excellent. Chief Tank?
Yes, and thanks for having me. So I'm on the HCA Substance Use Recovery Services Advisory Committee, SURSAC. That is the committee that is doing the response to the Blake decision. And I'm the co-chair, as you know, Caleb, of the data subcommittee group. And in fact, we are trying to figure out how to collect different points of data in reference to the law. And in fact, Jeremy did a fabulous presentation to SURSAC a few weeks ago. Yesterday, we had our most recent meeting, and one of the participants in that meeting talked about data collection of law enforcement agencies. And what this person said is that law enforcement agencies do not properly collect data. And then in fact, the person said that because it's not important to law enforcement. And my response was that it's tremendously important. However, most law enforcement agencies have not had the resources or the expertise of people to do that particular data collection. So I do believe that having a data analysis person to be able to take a look at different areas of data. I think that when we approach this, though, we need to approach it from a perspective of the public view, because we want to be able to have data analyzed and to have the public eyes on it as well, and not to be in a way where it's just in a closed vacuum for law enforcement personnel. Because even on the call, that's one of the concerns, is that as we take a look at this data, who's looking at it, So I think it's important to have that lens to know that it's an outward facing type of position. And then any reports that may be produced would be surely accessible to the public. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a great idea. Thank you.
So just in summary then, Chief Tank, I'm hearing that it's important to recognize that the information gathered or the function of the person who would fill this role is to make publicly facing and essentially transparency reports that, bring data to light, that bring issues to the forefront, that we're not trying to hide anything, and that it makes it clear to the public that, the reports are for their use in general, and they also will be beneficial for policy and decision-making groups.
I think that would be the expectation of the public.
Yeah, I agree. And the other point that you made was that, at least you had gotten the feedback that law enforcement doesn't do a good job of collecting data. And I would say that we've talked about this over the years, and I'm not sure at what depth in this particular conversation, because honestly, a lot of these meetings run together in my head, so I apologize for that. But the key component here is a lot, and I do mean a lot of the efforts that law enforcement in general goes through to collect data is not meant for the reasons that we're trying to use the information now. Meaning that when law enforcement goes interaction by interaction by interaction, they're not necessarily collecting information for ultimate, transparency to the public and 100% clarity on exactly what they're doing. They're looking for information that helps streamline processes internally, to identify pieces of information or people that make links and connect links. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the information was always intended to be used for large demographic information. People don't always get a clear picture of demographic information when they're interacting with law enforcement. Say, for example, you're simply just having a phone call with somebody. There's no real way to categorize a phone call interaction with a law enforcement officer in terms of gender identity, racial background, ethnic identity, all those sorts of things. They don't necessarily come up in conversation, and so it's difficult to get that information for that interaction. So I would say, again, just broad brushstrokes, that law enforcement data collection wasn't ever really intended for that, long-term usage. And so that's my takeaway from that point. Is that accurate, Chief?
Well, I think to some extent, but I think what this person was simply saying is, for example, since the Blake decision, that the notion is that law enforcement is supposed to give a referral and a diversion, to an individual, and those diversions and referrals right now are entered into sector, which is a statewide information system that is maintained by the Washington State Patrol. But the question, for example, is like, how many referrals have been done statewide? Who has access to those numbers? They're not looking for a particular personal identifying information, but which agencies are making the referrals, which agencies aren't. So it's that type of data, for example, that is not publicly available, but probably should be. So I think that's where this person was coming from.
Okay, excellent. Jeremy.
Adjacent to both the commentary of public-facing information as well as the challenges of building the information infrastructure and staffing in order to manage all this data, I want to really set the expectation and also counter the impression that in the public eye, I think a lot of folks are accustomed to interacting with medical systems. Medical systems, every time you interact with them, a record is created. And when people say, well, let's go into the justice system information, pull their information out, it is, the analogy I keep using is, it's not that you can't, use a toaster as a martini shaker. It's just that your, martinis are going to taste kind of weird because you're asking to do something that was never designed to do. And I don't want to undersell the challenge, both administratively and from a policy standpoint as well, that in order to create a digital information space that isn't simply a matter of switching on technology, is that it impacts the workflow from kind of start to finish, which is much easier said than done. And I don't want to underplay the challenge of that.
Excellent point. So I just want to make sure that I'm hearing you similarly to what I heard from Chief Tank. Simply gathering the three things that I mentioned, an infrastructure, a software piece, and a person doesn't mean that we've got a magic wand and things are just going to be easily taken care of and we just turn the switch on and move forward in the future. Is that right?
Correct. There's a conversation to be had where, again, from simply if you go to a clinic and they ask you your name 3 or 4 times, they need to make sure they're giving the right treatment to the right patient. It's unfathomable that you wouldn't record the interaction. Law enforcement is so dramatically different in terms of workflow, scope, and expectations. And it's one of those moments of this may or may not end up impacting how the work is done, how it's recorded.
Excellent points. Thank you. Stephen.
So I think there've been a couple of really critical points made so far. I think Chief Tanksley's point ought to be the focal point to begin with is who's the audience for this. I think there are all sorts of good reasons why existing systems are siloed, because they're serving purposes and relatively limited purposes of the agency that's collecting that information. And I think what we're after here, and your three-part proposal, Caleb, is directed at that, is serving functions outside individual silos. So I think Jeremy's point is really cogent also. I would strongly support moving ahead and trying to work with Barry and the council to put some budget figures on those three components. Those just get us to the edge of the questions that Jeremy was raising was, you know, once we see what, we don't even see what that information is outside the silos. So, and they're not meant to create policy or even to provide accountability for that information. So once we see what it is, we'll know what it is, how other players in the system can use that information. We'll see what's not there. We'll know how to structure the information we gather, perhaps a little differently, and we'll be able to interchange that information. But that whole set of questions that Jeremy pointed to, I think will become more obvious, and we'll have something to work with, something to build on if we go forward with your proposal, Caleb.
Okay, and lovely points, excellent all the way around. I'm going to wrap up this section, I think, unless anybody else has anything important, by saying that, you know, kind of the idea was born out of the index committee's need to get information from various different agencies, departments, you know, representatives in the criminal justice system, not simply looking at the jail as a repository, not simply looking at each individual law enforcement agency, but certainly there's information that the courts have, that the law enforcement agencies have, that the prosecutor's office has, that will influence the overall picture. But if we don't gather the information in a meaningful way, we're never really going to get a good idea of what's going on in our system. And this would be a good starting place. And again, I agree with Jeremy. This is not a, hey, cool, we got it all figured out point, but this is definitely a starting point where we might start small and gather some little bits of information and build on that. But we got to start somewhere. And so I think that this is a good starting place. This is a discussion. I don't think we have to vote on it. But I just wanted to point out that, part of this discussion is listed what a scope of work might look like, and I will be building that scope of work. The question on your agenda packet that says housed where is really a question of, if we had an FTE, where would that FTE be better served to be? In my brain, it makes sense to have somebody at the county level working in this FTE, simply because, I work for the county. Maybe that's as easy as that. But and then the discussion beyond that is, if the person works in the county, where should this particular FTE be housed? I've heard ideas like the exec's office, the council office, the sheriff's office. They certainly would have to work with IT. So there are some potential options for that. Anybody have any strong opinions about those concepts? I realize I was trying to wrap this up too quickly. I apologize. Not seeing any strong opinions, we're going to move on to the next point. So I appreciate that. I hope that I've gotten all the feedback, and the record's going to be able to show that we'll and I can go back and take notes on the record. So I appreciate all your guys' input on that. So item number 3 on your agenda packet is a discussion about data dissemination. So there's a project that was essentially originated from the task force that we wanted to try and make sure that information that was already being produced could be disseminated to the task force and other partners and be made publicly available. Stephen, I will reach out to you. I know that you were involved in this initially, and I want to make sure that I'm being sensitive of the things that you want to say about this. So I will pass the baton to you unless you don't want it.
Thanks, Caleb. I'll just start out. I had a chance to watch the recording of your last meeting, and I appreciated the beginning of this discussion. There seemed to be some questions or unclarity floating around in that discussion. So let me try to speak to what I recall was sort of up in the air. The 3-part system development that Caleb was just describing in the previous agenda item is sort of like, I don't want to oversell it, but it's like the Lamborghini of data systems. And what this data dissemination policy is sort of the 1-speed bicycle version of that. It comes out of a recognition that we are gathering data, we are reporting within the system a fair bit of data. We may not be sharing it as well as we could. We may not be using it for policy decisions as well as we could. But the point was of the policy, of the data dissemination policy, was to try to wrap our arms around what we have. And since we haven't been using it for policy, at least in the task force, we haven't been using it for transparency and public information, as Chief Tank encouraged us to do. The data dissemination proposal was intended to serve those purposes with what we have. So one of the questions was, is it calling on people to create new reports? No, it was not. Is it calling on the index committee to analyze formatting and try to change formatting to seek some uniformity or clarity? No, it was not. The index team is the best we've got for sort of cross-silo system perspective on the data that we have. And that's why there was some deferral to the expertise that exists in this committee membership. But really what we're trying to do is from on-the-street interventions like GRACE and LEAD and EMS and to early stage law enforcement interventions, which would be the Sheriff's Co-Responder Program, COBs, Alternative Response Team, and other interventions like that, to jail bookings, to jail residents with Wendy's reports, to, I don't know, drug court, all sorts of things. There is data being gathered. How much it's being shared is not completely clear to me. But the idea was to compile those reports, move them up a ladder, so to speak, I guess, so that the task force has access to them, because it was sort of a surprise to some of us how much data was being gathered, because we never saw that in our deliberations. We didn't think to ask also, so I'm not casting blame there. So that the task force has access to that data that may inform decisions we're making, or the absence of data may cause us to try to make requests for expansion of data, but also to allow us to post it make the public more aware of the work that goes on with this within the system. Because both for communications purposes of our work and for public input in this, in thinking about a new jail, all sorts of things, the public is it's apparent not as well informed as most of us would like it to be to form its own opinions and provide those opinions. So that was the purpose of the data dissemination policy. And I think I touched on some of the questions that I heard posed last time. And I think what Jill added in the packet is the beginning of the next step, which is to sort of inventory, which I think the index committee had at least started on, was to inventory what those reports are so that we can get them to Jill and start to see what they are and see what use we can make of them beyond the silos that they're already being used in now.
Thank you for those points, Stephen. I think that makes a lot of sense. I know that some of us have already begun the work of not just identifying those reports, but also sending them to Jill, because, you know, like you said, we're already creating the reports in a lot of cases anyway. So it was just a simple matter of making sure that she was included in the dissemination. I don't know if any of that resonates with anybody else, or if anybody had questions or concerns.
So Caleb, I would say one of the questions, and I think Wendy raised this specifically, if further inquiries or additional work needs to be done, question arises, of course, about the capacity to take on more work. And that's obviously a core point for us to appreciate. And so even at the point of making inquiries, requesting that people send reports on a regular basis to Jill for compilation, that may be a task that is beyond index members also. I would certainly volunteer to work with Jill on making those requests as we identify who we'd make the requests to. So again, the idea of the policy was not to overly burden index members or particular agency participants, but it's still intended to serve the purpose that the data can provide us on a higher level.
Excellent, thank you. Jill, I saw you come on. Did you have something for us?
Yeah, I just really wanted to reinforce that I'm happy to reach out to folks to get this data. I just don't know what reports or what data information exists currently and who is producing that. So I'm really just looking to mine that kind of information from all of you here on the committee. If you're aware of any kind of data reports that you're seeing on a somewhat regular basis in your field, in interacting with the people that you interact with, and are willing to pass that contact information on to me, I'm happy to reach out to those folks. So yeah, that's really all I'm looking for, are names and contacts.
Excellent. So I hear what you're saying, both Stephen and Jill. I appreciate those points. We will, in all likelihood, Stephen, I would lean on you to collaborate with Jill to reach out for those requests. I think that sounds like an appropriate thing, and I do appreciate you stepping up for that. We'll gladly push work your way. So
yeah, I'd be glad to play that role.
I appreciate that. Okay, anything else on this subject before we move to the last item before other business? I'm not seeing anybody's hands, so we're going to work through a short, it's actually an edited version of a video of Jill, you'll have to help me with the name of the committee that saw this presentation. But the presentation is on the Whatcom Resource Information Collaborative. And it is a model that is already in place and in use in our community. Jill, what was the name of the committee that saw this presentation?
The Behavioral Health Committee of the task force had this presentation, and I stitched together some excerpts from it. Forgive my novice editing skills. So whenever you're ready, you want me to go ahead and play this? It's about 5 minutes long in its entirety.
So I would just say before you press play, Jill, that what we're looking for here is ideas, concepts, and is this something that we would want to know more information about for a future task or index committee meeting? So as you're watching it, please consider those points. And Jill, if you will press play, thank you.
I will. And Caleb, you'll let me know if the audio is not working well.
I absolutely will. Jill, the audio is not working.
Is the starburst model, and at the center is the public data utility. For all intents and purposes, just the data.
It's still rather garbled, Jill. I wonder if you go through and do the share audio setting again on your screen share.
All right, now let's try it again.
We are working with protocol.
I think that's better.
That is established by an organization called ERRS. It has to do with the taxonomy and searchability of databases. And we are in the process of learning a lot here in Whatcom County about how to do this well. We are in phase 1 data utility. We're creating, this has been created, and now we're creating policy around how, what the data is, how it gets put in, all that kind of stuff. We are moving towards phase 1B, which is system navigation and resource access training, whereby we will first focus on training the staff at the coordinated access points or the membership organizations and asking those entities to help train the people they serve. But there will also be some direct training available to the public about how to access the resources. 2 to 4 years after we're done with phase 1B, we look forward to being able to integrate with their case management tools. One of the things that has always limited Whatcom County's response to creating the system was when the data utility and the care case management system were married, where they were together, because no one organization can be served well by any one care case management tool. So we have specifically and intentionally kind of divorced the data utility from care case management tools. And what our vision is that we're creating a data utility that in the future can work with any care case management tool that wants to plug into it. So the Gelatos of the world, the Aunt Berthas of the world, the Unite Us's of the world, if they are willing to invest in writing kind of a technological bridge between our data utility and their case care management tool, we will allow them that access so that they can work most efficiently from the data, from the information in our data. We'd like to look at that. So then we have the actual data utility. It's just a database. We've chosen to use open source technology for a variety of reasons. One, we do not want to be locked into any one proprietary system where we cannot make the changes that we want to make in order to serve our community. Two, there's lower cost to using open source. And three, we're working with Open Referral, which is a consultant business out of New York, who is doing this type of work all over, and they are working specifically in Washington State with our 211 systems and with Parent 123 and other communication. But just for the sake of showing you this, you can search food. You click basic food and you ask for a search, and it shows you the organizational records for organizations that have some sort of service doing food. And there are a variety of tags, which are part of the AIRS taxonomy, and by which this can be searched. But if you're not someone who responds to words very well, and you're like, I just need some pictures, you can go to categories, and there's some pictures that say, okay, I need food, and you can just click on the icon to do the search, and it'll take you to get you the same results. So you can search by service, you can search by category or organization. And while you're in the database, if you find that information is wrong or that you're having a hard time finding something, at a click of a button, you can make a suggestion to the system for a change. It also tells you about WRIC, and then it has the language.
Thank you, Jill, for playing that. And so I watched the whole video. It did pique my interest early on, as again, it's something where they're not using all of the information in the exact same way that we would here, but it is at least a community-wide resource for gathering information. And so I was like, hey, maybe this is something that we should be, as an index committee, looking into further. Anybody have an opinion about whether we would like to have a more depth presentation from the WRIC folks? Chief.
I just want a little bit of clarification. It looks really interesting. The first part of what I understand was really going to be a resource for folks who were providers, so that if it was case manager, they had a client who needed X, Y, or Z, they could go in and start finding some of those resources. Or did I misunderstand what that was about?
I think that there's multiple facets to the actual resource, but one of them is that where, again, there are physical resources that you can go to find, or if you were trying to connect somebody with resources. But the interesting portion about it, and I'm completely paraphrasing and also summing up something that I don't know completely about, but it sounded to me as though it was a data collection tool that gathered information from various different facets of information sources, collected it all into one, and then using open source software made information available and literally public facing, where you can go onto a website and go, I need to know more about this and I need to know more about that. And from that interactivity standpoint, from the public facing standpoint, from the transparency standpoint, I was just interested in what's going on here. Maybe there's something that we can shamelessly steal in terms of the overall technology, the framework, all of that. And so whether it would be exactly that function, I don't know, but it just seemed to pique my interest in terms of like, could this work for us? I don't know, maybe. Stephen.
Thanks, Caleb. I was at that behavioral health meeting for the presentation. So I would say a couple of things. One is it does appear to be sort of the infrastructure piece that you were talking about in your three-part scheme. A platform that crosses silos, crosses organizations. So I think it's something that's in the ballpark that index members might benefit from a presentation on and have some questions about its value to our purpose. Maybe there's even some connection or a representative from index participating in some of those conversations. I don't know, that would come later. The cautions I would say is it's apparent that they have a fairly rigid developmental protocol because they're using this system that's already in existence. It's very longitudinal. You heard Christy Sleddy, the presenter, talking about 2 to 4 years out. So they're very slowly and very methodically building this thing. So that would be a caution for its value to us. And the other thing is it's really, really comprehensive across social services. So it's much broader in scope than I think what Index or the task force itself would be looking for. And so I think there would be questions to explore there is, does the time frame really fit with what we're trying to do? Does the scope of it overwhelm what we're trying to do? But I think it would be valuable to hear a fuller, deeper presentation and be able to ask those questions and push back and forth, about possible connections with task force work.
Excellent. Chief.
And to follow up what Stephen was saying, because what I was hearing was a great resource kind of warehouse, and that if you've got somebody with these needs or who's telling you that they might have had interaction with this organization over here, that crossing of information would be wonderful. But I didn't hear descriptions that answer a lot of the questions that I'm hearing coming out of the task force and out of the SAC, which is, who are people that are getting into this kind of issue? What co-occurring other things that I'm not hearing the decision support system built in part of it. I'm seeing that or hearing, and granted, like Jill said, it was 5 minutes. So, but what I'm hearing is a one-on-one that there's that, but if you're looking at populations, not so much. Now, maybe that's the capability, or that's going to be kind of a new arm to this kind of a system. Having something that's easy to use and easy to access and still can accommodate the privacy issues that always come up when we're talking about. But because that's where quite frankly, that's where we've failed in the past, is that the systems that we have utilized have been to provide a business platform for us to do what we need to do. None of our systems are really designed to utilize and mine that data to help inform the larger picture. What trends we're seeing, and where, if you do this, what happens here, and what really are the people that we're looking for. Something popped up on my listserv today that talks about it. It's a study that's been done by, I think it's Prison Policy Initiative, and they've gone through the state of Washington and broken out by zip code the number of people who are in state prison and what the incarceration rate is for that. Not surprisingly, they found Tacoma was #1 with all of its, but they also talked about you can have an area and you can look within that city and find that this is where you've got uptick in, this is where, and so what they've been able to do is utilizing that plus information, I'm assuming they got at DOC, that was intriguing to me. And so I was able to pull it up and start looking, of course, in the Whatcom County area, because that's where I'm most interested. But having that built in on the front means that they don't have to recreate this committee at a later date to try and do the same thing. It's great to have the data, but if it's not designed so you can pull it out and link it, it's of limited use.
Yeah, and that's the point that Jeremy was making earlier as well, where it has to start from the people who are inputting the information, and it has to be put into the systems in a way that they can actually be used later on.
Yeah.
Good point. Stephen.
Yeah, I think the chief's question is a really good one about whether it could or does deal at a population level or an aggregate level. That would be a good discussion to have with the folks in this system. But I will also say that I think one of the things we found over the years of the task force is there are handoff points with any individual, and we're not good at making those passovers between services, and people drop through those cracks. They discontinue services, they drift out of the orbit, and they're back recidivizing. And so even on an individual level, and that's what I got so far out of that, is it is a way to connect organizations dealing with the same individual, and that could have some value for us. It's sort of what Grace and Lead must be doing on some level as they make connections and referrals and follow people to make sure they succeed. So even on an individual level, there might be some value in what we're seeing here. And there may be other parts that we're not seeing or that are yet to be built in that system that could deal at that more aggregate level that the chief was referring to.
Excellent points. Yeah, I feel like I'm looking at this in a couple of different ways. Number one, like we talked earlier, it's sort of that infrastructure piece that maybe we could use just the infrastructure, not everything else, but just the infrastructure to sort of meet the needs of this particular situation that we're in. And the other piece was I was looking at the resource aspect of a sister organization in our community that is doing the same, essentially working towards the same goal as we are in our community. And it would be nice to have the interface available if that were a thing that we could accomplish. So, okay, excellent. Hearing no strong objection, or unless I hear a strong objection, I'm going to see about getting a larger presentation from the WRIC group for our October meeting. Speak now or forever hold your peace. I'm not hearing anything strong about that. That being said, we're going to move on to the next item on the agenda, which is number 5, which is other business. Does anybody have anything for the good of everybody here? Seeing no hands, we're going to move on to public comment. Jill, can you help with public comment for me, please?
Sure. It doesn't look like we have anyone attending in person in the conference room. It looks like I have a couple people as attendees. If any of you would like to speak to the index committee, please virtually raise your hand now by selecting the raise hand icon or by pressing *9 on your phone. And no hands raised.
Excellent. Thank you, Jill. And with that, everybody, I want to thank you for your time, and we are adjourned.